Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Hello, salam, and welcome to #What the Patriarchy, where we are working to completely uproot the patriarchy from Islam. #inshallah, one book at a time, one feminist book at a time. Today we're continuing our discussion of Kecia Ali's classic Sexual Ethics and Islam, Feminist Reflections on Qur'an, Hadith, and Jurisprudence. This is the 2016 edition. The book was originally published in 2006. I recommend the 2016 edition. It's more revised and more expanded and more updated. You'll recall, of course, that I promised to do a few episodes or several episodes on this book instead of just one, like I've been doing for the last several books that we've done so far. So in the last episode, we talked about the main points of the book, the introduction, and chapter 1, which was on all things marriage. In this episode, we're going to cover chapter 2, which is on divorce, and chapter 3, which is on slave concubinage or sexual slavery, or just the idea of a man being allowed to sleep with a woman that he is enslaving, formerly known as his female slave, quote unquote. But we don't use that language anymore. That's inappropriate. Now, for chapter 2, again, on divorce. In this chapter, the author highlights the inequities of divorce laws in the fiqh, and the ways that these inequities are part and parcel of the whole system of marriage that the classical and historical jurists, Muslim jurists, the fuqaha, designed. We read about the many different kinds of divorce that the fiqh allows Muslims. There's talaaq, which is a unilateral type of divorce, conveniently available to men only for whatever reasons, whenever he feels like it. Khul, which is a type of divorce that is available to women only. Fasq, or judicial divorce, which is also available to women only, and a divorce that a woman can initiate based on the conditions of her marriage contract. Now, let's begin with one of the most ridiculous types of divorces, which is triple talaaq, when a husband says, I divorce you 3 whole times, and voila, the wife is divorced just like that. And BT dubs. You know how they say that women are emotional and men are so logical, which apparently is the opposite of emotional? Yeah, that's said by literally the same exact folks who invented the idea of a triple talaq, which allows a man, again, to divorce a woman for whatever reason he wants in a whim, just like that. And triple talaq is absolute, meaning the husband can't take it back during the iddah or the waiting period that some other kinds of divorces can be taken back in. It's considered makruh, not haram, so it's disliked or reprehensible or something that you shouldn't do, but it's not haram. This is only the Sunni view. For Shia jurists, all divorces require witnesses, so no divorce is valid without a witness, and only one pronouncement of divorce is valid at a time. So therefore, triple talaq in Shia fiqh is completely unacceptable and haram. Did you know that Muslims are also starting to ask questions like, can I divorce my wife over, Muslim men are starting to ask questions like, can I divorce my wife over a text message? Or is my divorce valid if I do it via a text message? Let me answer that question for you. If it is unethical, it is objectively un-Islamic, so no, not Islamically valid. I don't care what the patriarchy tells you. If something is unethical, it cannot possibly be Islamic. It cannot possibly ever be okay with God. Folks, we have got to revise our understanding of Islam. If we can say with a straight face that something is unethical and still view it as Islamically acceptable, that's not Islam, that's patriarchy, that's you. Okay, so of course, Islam does recognize divorce as a necessary thing that exists, not as a necessary evil, by the way. That's really, really important. Divorce is not an evil thing in Islam. The Qur'an explicitly permits it. All Islamic sources recommend reconciliation whenever possible and more appropriate, but divorce is an option that is available to everybody, to all Muslims. And do not trust people who say that it's not encouraged or that it's, again, a necessary evil, because as Professor Asifa Qureshi Landes shared in a Facebook post a couple of years ago, it's not khul or a woman's divorce that is discouraged, but talaaq, which is a man's divorce. And that's because of the very, very unethical nature of talaaq. Because you see, the English word divorce isn't a good equivalent for the Arabic word talaaq, because in the fiqh, not in the Qur'an, but in the fiqh, Talaaq is very specifically the husband's choice to end the marriage. And the husband can do it whenever he wants to, regardless of his reasons. Again, because the patriarchy allows men to act on their emotions. And the wife gets absolutely no say in it. When a man talaqs his wife, she gets to keep her mahar, the dower that the wife is entitled to at the time of her marriage. Theoretically, she gets this. She doesn't always get this. We talked about this in the last episode, the connection between mahar and divorce and marriage. Hopefully you remember. But the patriarchal logic is that mahar is a price that a man pays his wife for sexual access to her, for having sexual access to her. And so when he chooses to let go of that access, then she has to keep the mahar. If she chooses to deny him sexual access by wanting a divorce, by wanting to leave him, then she has to return the mahar. That's the important connection. But she doesn't always have to give her mahar back in every divorce. Another type of divorce is a judicial divorce, which is more preferable than khula, because the wife gets to keep her mahar this way. The wife can dissolve the marriage through the court, so she has to involve a judge in this if she has what are considered legitimate reasons. Again, legitimate according to the patriarchy. Whereas the fiqh, again, conveniently, allows men to divorce for whatever reasons at any time. The women can divorce only under certain reasonable conditions. Reasonable according to whom? You guessed it, according to the patriarchy. So something like not liking your husband doesn't count according to fiqh, not according to Islam, which explicitly contradicts a hadith on divorce, one of the many hadiths we have on divorce, in which the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ does allow a woman to divorce her husband, whom she recognizes is a good person, a person of good character and everything, but she just isn't attracted to him. And so he tells her, okay, you're divorced, just give him back what he gave you for mahar. The fiqh, however, says, no, you can't just divorce someone just because you don't like him. These reasons vary from school to school, though, and this is really important. So for some schools, for some madhahib, something like the husband not providing for his wife or family is legitimate grounds. Abuse is legitimate grounds. Sexual impotence is legitimate grounds. Imprisonment or disappearance, the husband's imprisonment or disappearance, is another ground. But the Hanafi school is interestingly the most restrictive when it comes to divorce. If the marriage has been consummated, according to the Hanafi fiqh, then the wife has almost no legitimate reasons to get a divorce. Not abuse, not life imprisonment, not lack of maintenance, the husband not taking care of her, not providing for her, nothing that the other, even this sometimes seemingly strictest schools like Hanbali, considered legitimate reasons. It is so ridiculous, folks, that if her husband goes missing or goes to jail, she would have, according to the Hanafi fiqh, she would have to wait until he would either die naturally or until he is 100 or until he would be 104 years old before she can be considered divorced. Patriarchy is irrational like that, you understand? The author finds that the Maliki law, Maliki fiqh, offers the most generous grounds for divorce for women, including non-support, so the husband not taken care of, not supporting his wife, abandonment, and injury. Not abuse, but injury, physical or otherwise. Khula, again, one of the divorces initiated by a woman, by the wife, requires the husband's permission or consent. She has to return the mahar in this case. It is considered absolute by almost all the jurists, meaning the husband cannot take her back or they cannot get back together during her waiting period. In another type of divorce, a wife can divorce her husband because she had stipulated in her marriage contract that if X happens, whatever that X is that they agreed upon in their marriage contract, then they will be divorced automatically. In this case, you do not have to involve the judge or the court. The author notes that while there are benefits to these kinds of stipulations, these conditions that we can put in our marriage contracts, they are not the solution to the inequities in divorce laws in fiqh, and they certainly don't restrict the husband's right to a unilateral divorce. The assumption, the default remains that the husband can do any of this stuff anytime he wants. He can still get a divorce anytime he wants. But for the wife to do it, she has to put it in her marriage contract. That's not a privilege. Why do I have to say it in my marriage contract? Why can't it be assumed that I have a right to something that my husband also has a right to? And it should not be unilateral for anyone. Unilateral anything should be completely prohibited, because that's exploitation of a person's vulnerability in too many cases. But the author is very careful to note here, as she always is, that while these theoretical ideas, these rulings and all, can seem very bleak for Muslim wives, they're not necessarily reflective of the reality of divorce in practice. We have plenty of evidence, for example, that these rules are flexible or very flexible in practice. And some research even suggests actually that they were perhaps more flexible in the past. Judges and courts were much more flexible in the past when it came to women seeking divorce than they are today. But of course, understandably, that reality varies from place to place and situation to situation and context to context. Oh, and fun fact, did you know that Abu Hanifa said that a woman should and may, Islamically speaking, kill her husband if the husband continues to seek sexual access to her, to the woman, once they have divorced? She shouldn't kill him aggressively or using a murder weapon though, because hello, that's not feminine. But she can use poison or drugs or something else, something more feminine, less aggressive. Now, you'll recall from our previous episode on this book that one of the main points of the book is that so many of the rulings on marriage and sex and divorce and family in fiqh, not necessarily in Islam, do not apply to contemporary Muslims. You normally expect religion to provide you with ideals that you can work toward. But if the stuff that's in fiqh are our ideals, then God help us all. Many Muslim countries have sort of acknowledged this, the fact that the fiqh is problematic when it comes to gender and marriage and divorce and so on. And they've responded to it in different ways using the language of reform, quote unquote. In this chapter, the author discusses current prospects for reform, the ways that Muslim majority countries have attempted to modify these ideas. So for example, some have tried to completely illegalize triple talaaq or require that a court intervene in divorce cases, or there are financial penalties for divorce on husbands who have no legitimate reasons to divorce their wife, or not requiring the husband's consent for something like khul if the wife returns her mahar herself. But the author notes that these are all methods that only attempt to curb men's impulsive and extrajudicial use or abuse of talaaq. They don't address the root cause of the problem. So for example, these reform efforts still treat these privileges like talaaq, male-initiated talaaq, as Islamically legitimate. They think that it's valid that the man has this right to begin with, and they're not working to get rid of the connection between marriage and ownership. And the fact that with some exceptions, the wife has to return the mahar in order to initiate a divorce is also an obstacle for women. All right, so that's chapter 2, and now we're going to talk about chapter 3, which is on sexual concubinage or concubinage and sexual slavery. So in this chapter, we learn a lot of disturbing stuff that makes us want to break a lot of other stuff, like the rules of concubinage. Oh, a concubine is a woman that a man gets to sleep with or rape, because enslaved people are not entitled to consent in sexual relations, without marrying her. Now, a concubine's primary role is sexual, but the man, according to fiqh, is also entitled to sexual access to any woman that he, quote unquote, owns or has purchased or enslaves. Enslaved women generally weren't the same as concubines. Not every enslaved woman was a concubine, and concubines were given extra privileges that other enslaved people were not given, like better food, better clothing, and sometimes not having to do any household labor at all. Yeah, so much for the whole no sex before marriage and or no sex with anybody you're not married to crap that is shoved down women's throats all the time. In the fiqh, a man is allowed to have as many concubines as well as to have sex with as many women that he wants to, whom he has enslaved, in addition to up to 4 whole wives. And folks, the scholars' evidence for allowing men to have as many concubines as he wanted, that the Qur'an doesn't limit this number. Yeah, that's their evidence. And side note, when Muslim feminists today use a lack of Quranic prohibition on something, or a specific claim in the Qur'an for something, and then we argue that therefore this should be allowed because the Qur'an doesn't prohibit it, we are laughed at, because apparently that means that we don't know Islam. Do you see how patriarchy gaslights and manipulates women? On the one hand, the Qur'an's supposed silence on the number of concubines a man is entitled to means that a man can have as many as he wants to. But on the other hand, when Muslim women or egalitarian conscious Muslims say, oh, the Qur'an is silent on this issue, so maybe it's maybe that silence is permission, the patriarchy says, no, 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 silence in that case means prohibition. What I never understood here is why there's even a limit on polygyny at all then. Because really, ethically speaking, there's absolutely no point to limiting polygyny if the man can then turn around and be like, okay, since I want more than 4 wives and I can't have them, I'm gonna go and have 86 concubines instead. And I get that a part of the answer here is that the status of the wife and the concubine or the enslaved woman is not the same. I get that. But my question is not simply about permission, but about ethics here. How ethical and unethical is any of this? If limiting polygamy was supposedly a question of ethics, what's happening with concubinage? I mean, there were dudes among these misogynists who legitimately claimed that it was disbelief, it was kufr, if a dude wanted to marry 4 women and 1,000 concubines and someone dared to criticize him for doing so. The critic, according to these dude scholars, is the one committing kufr, not the person marrying 4 wives and thousands of or having thousands of concubines, just for pointing out to the sexual exploiter that you can't be doing shit like this, man. The Quranic verses granting a person sexual access to the person that they have enslaved are not gendered. But given that men like to pretend that they are the ultimate audience of the Qur'an, they did decide that God is talking only to them. Oh, but actually, there's a very powerful anecdote that Kecia Ali talks about in her other book on marriage, called Marriage and Slavery in Early Islam, where a woman does argue and she insists that she Qur'anically is allowed to sleep with the men that she's enslaving. And Omar, the Khalifa Omar, is like, yeah, something must be wrong with you mentally if you think this is allowed to you. Now, the ways that Muslim jurists in the past or historical Muslims talked about slavery or the idea or sexual relations with enslaved people isn't something too unusual, since slavery was historically common and officially illegalized only very recently. Viewing women and girls as sexual commodities was not treated as a condemnable thing in the past. By enslavers, though, right? Because enslaved people did find it condemnable. But also the fiqhi idea of milk al-yamin, or ownership by the right hand, comes from the Quranic ma malakat aymanukum. Some contemporary Muslims like to pretend that this never happened and that a man could only sleep with his slave women if he married them first. But this isn't the case according to the men of fiqh, and I have even heard some contemporary dude scholars explaining it as, well, why would he marry her since he purchased her, and that serves as the mahar, essentially. In other words, through mahar, through the dower, a man buys his wife, just like a man buys a woman that he will enslave and will have sexual access to by paying another person. The link between mahar and dower, or mahar dower and the purchase price, isn't unusual for pre-modern fiqh, and we talked about this in the previous episode. But when contemporary Muslims or contemporary Muslim preachers use this argument, it is especially disturbing. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had at least 2 concubines, Maria Qibtiyya, or Maria the Copt, being the more famous one. Although some Muslims today think that that's not the case, that never happened. Humans of the weird human species just like to rewrite history like that. Oh, also, did you know that some Muslims were legitimately not cool with abolishing slavery, which is why it took a really long time in certain Muslim majority countries? Because how dare we forbid something that God did not explicitly forbid? And the arguments in support of slavery in Muslim contexts, by the way, are so similar to those in Christian contexts that it's almost as if it has nothing to do with God or religion or scripture, but with people's egos and privileges. Muslims in fiqh are prohibited from enslaving other Muslims. But what is interesting here is that conversion to Islam did not grant one freedom. I can't imagine what kind of a world we would be living in now if we had freed people through conversion, if conversion to Islam meant freedom from slavery. You see, the scholars had this option. they could make this a ruling. They could have decided that conversion to Islam meant freedom from slavery. I mean, it would have been so easy, and greedy people who want more converts to their religion would have gotten what they wanted, a higher number of followers of their religion, and slavery would have eventually ended much faster than the way that it did in reality. But then again, if that were the case, if we didn't have slavery anymore, who would feed the greed of the dudes who benefited from slavery? The author here points out that the Quran does acknowledge slavery as a reality and also offers several ways for freeing enslaved people. For example, freeing a slave is required as expiation for certain sins, which suggests that the Quran does not expect a person's status as enslaved to remain permanent, and it expects it to change. And also that the Quran doesn't seem to think that slavery is just. Now, theoretically, there were certain rules in place for how one was supposed to treat the people that they were enslaving. So for instance, the fiqh tells us that if you mistreat the person that you're enslaving, then they would be freed with no compensation to you as the enslaver. Slaves were entitled to marriage. They could be married off by their enslavers. And an enslaver could not simultaneously enslave a woman who was his wife. If an enslaver slept with his female slaves, then any children born from that were to be free and were considered legitimate children of the mother's enslaver, of the master. And these children, theoretically, had the same status as any free children born to the man's wives. And the woman could no longer be sold to anyone else, and upon the death of her enslaver, of her master, she was automatically freed. She and her kids were both automatically freed. You should know that too many Muslims like to use examples like these, like the specific details I just gave, to claim that, see, Islamic slavery was so much better than, say, American slavery, and that's why it's not haram. If done right, it's not haram, it's not immoral. But this kind of apologetic is not okay because it totally misses the point. The author also in this chapter talks about some of the different ways that contemporary Muslims today deal with, this problematic part of our past. So for example, some Muslims completely deny that slavery ever happened, or that slavery was ever allowed in Islam, or that the fuqaha ever allowed it, and so on. Others talk about slavery as if it is not abolished, as if it's still happening and it's still acceptable morally. And then there are those that explain it and justify it defensively and apologetically. So for example, they might say that when God gives permission for sleeping with enslaved people, it's just to make sure that slaves are integrated into society, or that the man is, only allowed to enslave people so that he can be responsible for them financially and otherwise. The author points out that these apologetics aren't sufficient for internal Muslim reflection, and in my opinion, not in the author's opinion necessarily, it's total crap. Because why do you have to enslave someone, the captives, to ensure that they're integrated into society? Why do you have to sleep with them to ensure that? The author does an excellent job showing how these contemporary/modern views, or these modern questions or rationales that we provide for slavery, are in clash with historical Islamic ideas. Do we accept these past ideals and ideas as Islamically acceptable just because they happened? Just because that was the norm for a certain class of people in the past from the enslaver's perspective? What are the implications of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and his companions' practice of capturing people and enslaving the women and giving permission to men, to capturers, to essentially rape the captured women? What are the implications of all of this for contemporary Muslims? Is it binding because the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ permitted it or did it himself, like, say, having a concubine? Or can we reject it today? If it is not binding today for today's Muslims because times and contexts are different, what does that mean about what else we're allowed to disagree with the past Muslim scholars on, just because today our standards, our ideals are different from theirs? Because you see, it affects the ways that we define the word sunnah or think of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ as a model for Muslims, for all Muslims everywhere at all times, but clearly with exceptions. And that, it turns out, sometimes means revising his life to fit our own contemporary ideals so that we can end up with, or so that we can end up projecting onto Islam, onto the Qur'an, onto the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, things that are important to us. So the chapter, like all the others, also points out that, like the other topics discussed in this book, marriage, divorce, same-sex relations, and so on. In the discussion on slavery, the main problem at hand seldom gets serious critical consideration. People talk around it, and very few actually confront the problem itself, that of the Qur'ans, the Sunnahs, the fiqh's acceptance of slavery as a legitimate thing. The fact that none of these sources ever really explicitly condemn slavery, including concubinage. And the remnants of the legal practices of slavery universally continue to haunt us, especially in the context of gender relations. And this scriptural acceptance poses problems for us, even as most of us today condemn slavery. But as usual, the author does provide some productive ways for us to think about these issues. And for Muslims who want to use Islamic arguments against slavery, here are two. The Qur'an implicitly does seek to abolish slavery. And the men of fiqh didn't interpret these verses as calling for abolition because of their implicit biases. We all have them. And I would also argue explicit biases of theirs. There are reasons to believe that the Qur'an itself does not permit sexual contact between the enslaver and the enslaved if we look at certain verses carefully. And I discussed some of those in my dissertation, in my chapter on sexual slavery. Slavery was also never intended or designed as a permanent reality, and this is clear from the way that the Qur'an talks about slavery. It's possible that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ didn't directly or explicitly abolish it, even though he had the choice or the opportunities to, yes, because of the limitations that were posed on him as a prophet. He wasn't all-powerful, and he had a mission to spread Islam. Fatima Marnisi, in the episode that you recall we did on her book, The Veil and the Male Elite, discusses the restrictions that Muhammad ﷺ faced as a prophet when it came to gender relations or when it came to dealing with women and marriage. Really, for the most part, the obstacles that he had to overcome were mostly powerful, elite, insecure men, some of whom unfortunately are given the title of Sahaba, companions. These arguments do have valid points, the author acknowledges, but they're not sufficient and certainly don't answer the question, where is God's justice in permitting an injustice like slavery if slavery was indeed an injustice? And the Quran talks about it like it is an injustice. And the author is very clear about the purpose of raising these questions and having this whole discussion. They are relevant to larger issues of ethics. Again, the whole book of the title of the whole book is Sexual Ethics and Islam. She asks, and I quote, "How can one reconcile God's justice and goodness with the injustice of slavery? Or does viewing God as just and good necessitate acceptance of slavery as part of the divine plan for humanity?" I don't have the page number for this. Oops. All right, I am all fired up and I have to go to my Taekwondo class. So I will have more for you next time, probably in a few months, inshallah. Stay feminist and stay kind. Salam.